The air that morning carried a weight no one could measure. It pressed down on the town of Faulkner like an invisible hand, heavy, humid and strange. July 19th, 1992. Just another Sunday in a place where Sundays always looked the same. Church bells faded into stillness, cicadas screamed from the trees, and the lake waited in its endless quiet. The sisters woke early. Emily, 17, was the responsible one, though. Lately she had been restless. Her friends said she stared out the classroom window. Too often her pencil idle in her hand, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Laura was 14, still caught between childhood and what came next. Her world drawn in notebooks, full of sketches of houses, animals' faces half finished. Together they were inseparable. To see one without the other was to feel something was missing. Their mother was exhausted that morning, slumped at the kitchen table after her night shift at the hospital. She rubbed her eyes, half listening, as her daughters moved around her, pulling bread and fruit from the cupboards, clinking glass bottles of soda into a wicker basket that had been passed down through years of summer outings. She told them to take advantage of the day, to keep close to the water, but not swim too far. Her voice was tired but soft, and as she spoke, she reached out a hand brushing a strand of hair back from Laura's forehead. Neither girl knew it would be the last time she touched them. The house smelled of coffee and old linoleum. The screen door creaked as they stepped into the sun, the air so thick with heat it seemed to shimmer. Gravel crunched under their sneakers as they walked toward Pickett's Lake, the basket swinging lightly between them. The sound of their laughter carried down the road, bright musical, the kind of sound that seemed to linger even after they turned the corner. The lake came into view like a sheet of glass framed by dense trees. The surface reflected the sky in such perfect stillness that it was difficult to tell where water ended and air began. A faint metallic odor drifted on the breeze, sharp and sour, as if something rusted lay just beneath the surface. Laura noticed it first. She wrinkled her nose, asked Emily if she smelled it. Emily laughed, teased her for being too sensitive, and the moment passed. But later, when investigators returned to that same shoreline, they too would pause, inhale, and remark on that strange metallic tang. A smell out of place, a smell no one could quite name. They found a patch of grass beneath a leaning oak, its branches stretched like brittle fingers over the water. There they spread the blanket, red and white, faded in places, the fabric warm under the sun. Emily opened a paperback novel, shading the page with her hand. Laura pulled a stick from the dirt, sketching shapes into the soil, pausing now and then to watch the ripples spread across the water. It should have been an ordinary day, a scene stitched into memory without weight or consequence. And yet from the start, the lake felt wrong. Fishermen in boats that morning swore they saw ripples moving against the wind, spreading in circles where no stone had fallen. Others recalled a sound, faint, irregular, like a hollow knock echoing across the surface. They dismissed it at the time, blaming carp beneath the water or branches drifting against the shore. But afterward, when there were no more explanations to lean on, they remembered it differently. By noon, the sun bore down with merciless heat. The cicadas screamed louder until the air itself seemed to vibrate with their cries. And then suddenly, impossibly, they stopped. The silence that followed was so complete, it made the world feel emptied. No birds, no insects, nothing but the still breath of the lake pressing against their skin. What happened next is not known. What is known is this: by 7 that evening the sisters had not returned home. Their mother came back from the hospital to an empty house. She expected chatter dishes left in the sink, the smell of food. Instead, she found silence. At first, she wasn't alarmed. Perhaps they had stayed late. Perhaps they had walked to a friend's. But as darkness settled in, her unease grew claws. By midnight, trembling, she held their photograph in her hands at the sheriff's office, her voice breaking as she told them. They never came home. The search began before dawn. Flashlights cut beams through the mist. Dogs barked. Deputies shouted names into the dark. By the time the sun rose, they had found the blanket. still spread neatly beneath the oak. The fruit had spoiled in the heat. The bread was stiff, the soda unopened, and the basket its handle snapped clean through lay half buried in the mud as if it had been dragged. The ground told the rest. Deep grooves scarred the soil leading from the blanket to the water's edge. Something heavy had been pulled there, something that left no trace once it reached the lake. Divers descended into the dark water, their lights swallowed within feet. The lake was colder than expected, biting unnatural for July. They searched for hours, but when they emerged, they carried nothing. No clothes, no bodies, no sisters, only silence. Days passed. The town held its breath. Posters appeared on telephone poles, their edges curling in the humidity. Cars slowed near the lake, drivers peering through open windows as if they might hear a voice calling faintly from the trees. Nights became unbearable for the mother who walked the shoreline, with a lantern whispering her daughter's names into the dark, until her voice collapsed into sobs. Weeks stretched into months. The lake remained silent. The only thing anyone found was a single shoe tangled in reeds miles from the picnic site, Laura's shoe. Inside, faint scratches marred the insole. Letters, almost but not quite forming a word. Some swore it spelled help. Others saw wait. The sheriff bagged it, labelled it, locked it away. But in Faulkner people whispered. They whispered about the ripples, the silence, the knocking sound. They whispered about the lake. And always when they spoke of that day, they lowered their voices as if afraid that something still waited in the silence listening. The search became the only language the town of Faulkner spoke. In those first days, it was frantic raw energy, fueled by disbelief. Fathers left their jobs, mothers gathered flashlights, children whispered that the sisters had simply gotten lost and would be found before supper. Deputies lined the roads with their cruisers' radios hissing in the background like restless ghosts. At dawn, the shoreline bloomed with volunteers, farmers in boots caked with mud, teenagers carrying sticks to prod the reeds, old men with lanterns that trembled in their hands. The lake, once a place of fishing trips and summer swims, transformed into something unrecognizable. Every inch of ground seemed to hold its breath, every shadow waited to be searched. Helicopters thundered overhead, their blades scattering flocks of crows from the tree line. Boats dragged nets across the surface, leaving trails in the mirror-like water. Divers returned again and again, their bodies shivering when they surfaced faces, pale lips blue, though the air was warm. One deputy would later admit what they had all felt the lake did not want to give them back. And yet there were traces. The broken basket, the half-eaten bread, the grooves in the soil. And near the reeds, investigators found something else, an impression in the mud, shallow but distinct, the shape of a hand. Too small for an adult, the fingers pressed deep as if clawing for purchase. A child's handprint smudged with water. The mother was told not to see it, but word reached her anyway. She collapsed when she heard her body folding as if her bones had been cut away. From that night forward, she no longer slept. She stayed at the water's edge, clutching a lantern, waiting for her daughters to come walking out of the trees. At first, people pitied her. They brought her food, offered words of comfort. But as weeks passed, pity turned to fear. They said she no longer blinked when she stared at the lake, that she spoke to it, that she whispered her daughters' names into the stillness, pausing as if waiting for the water to whisper back. The official search dwindled after the first month. Resources thinned, volunteers stopped coming. Posters faded on telephone poles, the ink bleeding into white. Deputies stopped walking door to door. The sisters' photographs yellowed under the sun, but the mother did not stop. She traced the grooves in the soil with her fingertips again and again, until they blurred into nothing. She sifted through reeds, her hands raw and bleeding from cuts. At night, she returned home only to write filling notebooks with fragments of memory. Emily's laugh, Laura's sketches, the sound of the screen door creaking when they left that morning. Her handwriting grew jagged, desperate, as if she were trying to pin their existence to paper before it slipped away. Denial gave way to suspicion. Rumors spread like wildfire through the town. Some said a drifter had been seen that week, a man in a dented pickup who bought gas and never returned. Others claimed it was someone local, someone who had known the sisters, someone trusted. Whispers named neighbors, friends, even deputies. Everyone's face carried shadows. But the most persistent suspicion pointed not to a man, but to the lake itself. Old stories resurfaced, tales told by grandparents around fireplaces, half-remembered warnings about Pickett's Lake. They said the water was bottomless, that divers could descend forever and never touch the ground. They said lanterns had been seen moving across the surface at night with no boats beneath them. They said animals would not drink there after dark. The knocking sound returned too. Residents swore they heard it echo across town. In the still hours after midnight, a hollow, irregular thud like wood striking from below. Some said it came from the water. Others claimed it came from their own walls. By the second month, fear seeped into daily life. Children no longer played outside after dusk. Families avoided the lake entirely, its once busy shore now abandoned reeds bending in silence. The air around Faulkner seemed to shift heavy with something unseen, something waiting. And then the panic. It was late September when a hunter stumbled onto the shoe tangled in reeds half a mile from the picnic site. Laura's shoe. The leather cracked, the laces stiff. The inside scratched faint grooves dug into the insole. At first, the hunter thought little of it. But when the sheriff's office confirmed it as hers, the town unraveled. The shoe was evidence. Proof the sisters had not simply run away as some had quietly suggested. Proof they had been dragged, taken, pulled. The scratches inside were studied, magnified, argued over. Help. Wait. No one could agree. The only certainty was that a child had pressed her nails into the fabric until they split. The mother clutched the shoe when they showed her rocking it against her chest. She was trying, she whispered. She was trying to tell me. From then on, she was seen less in town. She stopped answering knocks at her door, stopped eating meals brought by neighbors. At night, her silhouette could be seen moving along the shoreline lantern, in hand stopping every few steps, as if she heard something no one else could. Deputies tried to coax her back, but she always said the same thing. If you listen long enough, you'll hear them too. The search slowed, then ended. The town returned to routine, but routine felt hollow. Every drive past the lake carried a new weight. Every quiet night seemed too quiet. Teenagers dared each other to sit by the water at midnight, to stay silent, to listen. Some claimed to hear laughter. Others swore they heard two voices whispering from the reeds, voices that stopped the moment you strained to understand the words. The sisters were gone. But the town had begun to realize something far worse. Gone did not mean silent. Years bled together, though no one could ever quite explain how. One autumn folded into another winter's, pressed down with their iron skies, and still the sisters did not return. By then, posters had been taken down, replaced by new flyers for yard sales, school concerts, county fairs. But in Faulkner, no one forgot. The lake remained a wound festering unhealed. By 1995, 3 years after the picnic, the family home stood like a shrine. The mother lived there alone, curtains drawn her windows, reflecting nothing but the trembling trees. People said she still spoke to her daughters out loud, her voice carrying through the cracked open screen door at night. Some neighbors swore they heard her humming lullabies, the sound thin, brittle, floating over the road like smoke. Others avoided the house, entirely crossing the street rather than walking past. Her decline was not sudden, but relentless. The once neat yard turned wild grass, rising knee-high weeds curling up the steps. The wooden boards on the porch warped, swollen from rain. And yet amid the decay, the mother's lantern never went dark. Every night she carried it to the edge of the lake, placing it carefully at the spot where the basket had been found. She never sat. She only stood, watching the water eyes, hollow lips moving, as though answering questions no one else could hear. The father could not endure it. After 2 years of grief curdled into silence, he left town. Some said he moved south. Others claimed he simply vanished into the roads. The mother never spoke of him again. The house bore only her shadow, wandering its rooms, tracing her daughters' faces in faded photographs taped to the refrigerator. And still the knocking continued. By now, it had spread beyond the lake. At first, only a handful of families complained hollow thuds against their walls. After midnight, always 3 or 4 strikes, never more. Dogs would rise suddenly from their sleep, ears pricked, growling at empty corners. Children woke screaming, convinced someone had been standing over their beds. But as the years dragged on, the sound became something darker. A pattern, a rhythm. As if the knocking were traveling, choosing homes at random, tapping its reminder into the town's bones. No one admitted it in daylight, but at night, fear grew teeth. Couples locked every door twice, pushed dresses against them. Teenagers who once dared each other to sit by the lake now refused even to walk near it. The water no longer shimmered in sunlight, it absorbed it. Always dim, always waiting. And then came the basket. It was the spring of 2001, nearly a decade after that last picnic. A storm had torn through the region, heavy rains swelling the lake and pulling debris from its depths. Days later, a fisherman reported something tangled in the reeds. Deputies arrived, boots sinking into mud, and pulled it free. The basket. It was the same one, the woven handle snapped, the lid hanging loose. The weave was swollen, warped, softened by years underwater, but inside, impossibly, there were still fragments. A strip of cloth patterned with faded flowers, a plastic spoon stained dark, a curl of blonde hair knotted around the handle. The discovery struck Faulkner like a match to dry grass. Crowds gathered again, television crews returned, deputies reopened files long shut. For the mother, it was both proof and punishment. She came down to the shoreline, fell to her knees when she saw it, her fingers trembling as she reached for the warped wood. Deputies held her back, afraid the evidence would be ruined. She screamed, then her voice ripping through the quiet like an animal's, the sound echoing across the water, startling birds into the air. "They're still here," she cried, her voice hoarse, collapsing into the mud. "Don't you see? They never left me." In town, people whispered, why now? Why after so many years had the basket returned, floating back to the place it had first been found? Some said it was the storm. Others said it was the lake itself spitting back what it no longer wanted. But the mother clung to a different truth, that it was her daughters sending a sign, proof they were near, proof they were speaking to her through the water. And soon, she was no longer alone. Over the next months, more people claimed to see things at the lake. A deputy reported lantern light drifting across the surface at midnight, though no boats had left shore. A pair of fishermen swore they heard girls' laughter from the reeds, clear and sharp, only to find the shoreline empty. A woman driving past one evening slammed on her brakes, insisting she had seen 2 children standing hand in hand on the road, their faces turned away, their dresses pale in the moonlight. When she blinked, they were gone. Stories spread until Faulkner could no longer contain them. Some dismissed it all as folklore, grief twisted into visions. Others insisted it was real. But no matter which side they chose, everyone agreed the sisters were still here, etched into the town's marrow, too heavy to disappear. The mother began writing again. Not notes or lists, but letters, page after page, addressed to Emily and Laura. She left them in glass jars at the water's edge, the paper inside curling with humidity, her words trembling in ink. Some washed away, some sank. But every week she returned with more, believing the lake carried them to her daughters. Time did not heal. It only deepened the silence. By the late 2000s, new families had moved to Faulkner. Children who had never known the sisters yet grew up in their shadow. They whispered about them at sleepovers, pointed out the house with the lantern, dared each other to step onto the mother's porch. To them, Emily and Laura were less girls than myth cautionary figures who belonged as much to the lake as the fish or reeds. And yet, beneath the stories, there was always the unspoken question, what truly happened that day, in 1992. Deputies kept the files open, though no new evidence emerged beyond the basket. No suspects were ever named. Theories were endless: abduction, drowning, ritual, runaway. Each felt inadequate, each frayed under the weight of silence. But the mother never wavered. "They are here," she would whisper to anyone who dared ask. "You only have to listen." The town listened. And at night, when the air was still, when the insects quieted, and the water reflected only the blackness above, some swore they heard it too, the faintest sound of girls humming carried across the surface like a secret. By 2010, nearly 2 decades after the picnic, Faulkner had grown quiet again. New storefronts had opened downtown, the high school football team had won a regional championship, and for a time it seemed the town had finally turned its back on the lake. But the families who had lived there long enough knew better. The silence was never absence. It was waiting. The mother remained fragile, but immovable. Her hair had silvered, her voice thinned, yet every night she carried the lantern to the same place by the reeds. Her neighbors watched her from their porches, whispering that she looked like part of the shoreline herself, weathered and permanent, as if she would one day dissolve into the water she worshipped. Then, on a late summer morning, the cycle began again. A group of contractors had been hired to clear brush along the northern bank, where the lake narrowed into a channel of stagnant water. The men hacked through vines, boots sinking into moss, their chainsaws startling herons into flight. And then one of them stopped his blade, stilled, his breath caught. At the base of a willow tangled in roots that reached down like fingers, something jutted from the soil. It was a shoe. Small white ones, now yellowed with rot. The leather stiff laces knotted a child's size. Deputies were called. Tape strung between trees, soil dug in careful handfuls. Soon another object surfaced, a hair-clip pink plastic cracked down the middle with the faint outline of a butterfly still visible. The town erupted. The shoe and clip were sent for testing, and though DNA had decayed, fibers matched clothing the girls had worn that day. For investigators, it was the first tangible clue in nearly 20 years. For the mother, it was confirmation, cruel and cold. "They're close," she whispered. Standing at the edge of the cordon, her voice hoarse, her hands trembling against the tape. "Closer than you think." The items were bagged, catalogued, locked away. But the willow where they were found remained, its roots exposed like veins. Children began daring each other to touch it, calling it the sister's tree. They said if you pressed your ear against the bark at night, you could hear knocking, soft, steady, like a hand trapped below. Stories multiplied. A fisherman swore he saw ripples spreading across the lake on windless nights, concentric rings that moved toward shore, then stopped as if waiting for him to notice. A farmer claimed he heard voices in his barn girls, whispering their words too faint to catch their laughter, cutting off the instant he struck a match for light. And still, the mother wrote her letters. But now something changed. Instead of jars at the water's edge, she began leaving them inside the willow's hollow. Some she slid deep between its roots, her handwriting frantic, the ink smeared as if written through tears. She never told anyone what the letters contained, but once a boy too curious for his own good pulled one free. It said only, "I hear you knocking. I hear you singing. I will not let them bury you." He never touched the tree again. The sheriff's office attempted to keep order, warning people against trespassing near the site. But fear spreads faster than fences. Soon visitors arrived from outside towns, curiosity seekers, amateur ghost hunters, true crime obsessives. They wandered the shoreline with cameras, dipped microphones into the reeds, called out the sisters' names as if expecting answers. And sometimes, answers came. One man caught audio of what he claimed were 2 faint voices humming in unison. Another filmed his lantern flickering wildly before cutting out entirely, though his batteries were fresh. Skeptics dismissed it all as coincidence, tricks of nature, human imagination bending under weight of myth. But for those who lived in Faulkner, the evidence was not in the tapes. It was in the air. The heaviness. The dread. the way the town seemed to inhale and hold its breath whenever the lake was mentioned. By 2012, the mother's health declined. She grew frail, her shoulders bent, her steps uneven. Yet she still made her way to the water each night, carrying the lantern that never seemed to dim. Some nights she lingered there for hours, standing silent until the lantern's flame guttered in the wind. Others swore they saw her speaking to the reeds, her lips moving steadily, as if answering questions no one else could hear. And then one night, she did not return. A neighbor found the lantern the next morning still burning at the edge of the reeds, but the mother was gone. Deputies searched the shoreline, dredged the shallows, combed the woods. Nothing. She had vanished as silently as her daughters. The discovery struck the town like a final blow. For some, it was proof that she had walked willingly into the water, claimed at last by the same force that had taken her girls. For others, it was something darker, that she had been summoned, called into the shadows of the reeds by voices only she could hear. Her disappearance closed the circle, and yet left it torn wider than ever. For years, the townsfolk debated whether to hold a memorial, but none could agree on what to memorialize. The sisters, the mother, the unanswered question that swallowed them all. Meanwhile, the willow stood taller, its roots spreading deeper into the soil, twisting around the hollow where her last letters lay hidden. Children avoided it. Fishermen cast wide of that bank. The air there seemed thicker charged, as if the ground remembered. And at night, when the lake was still, those who dared to listen claimed the knocking had changed. No longer random, no longer frantic. It had grown measured, patient, like a hand that knew you were there and would wait forever for you to answer. Years after the mother's disappearance, Faulkner existed in a strange kind of paralysis. The town carried on in daylight shops, opening bells at the church, chiming football games under the Friday night lights. But underneath, everything felt suspended. Conversations trailed off when the lake was mentioned. Teenagers still whispered about the sisters' tree, daring each other to touch its bark, though most never got closer than the fence. Parents kept children indoors after dusk, and no one lingered on the water when fog rolled low across its surface. The lake had become more than a body of water. It was an open wound. Yet for outsiders, the mystery had ripened into fascination. By 2015, podcasters arrived, followed by documentary crews. They prowled the shoreline with cameras, unfurled drone wings above the reeds, and staged interviews in dim-lit kitchens with locals who had grown weary of telling the same story. Each group promised answers. Each left with only fragments, muddy boots, distorted audio, grainy footage of rippling water that seemed to pull itself inward, then flatten back into stillness. The people of Faulkner hated them for it, not because they disturbed the soil, but because they fed the thing that lived in the silence. Every interview, every podcast episode was another echo, another ripple. Then came the journal. In the winter of 2017, the county purchased a parcel of land near the North Bank, intending to clear it for a public trail. Excavators cut deep into the frozen ground, scooping up decades of roots and rock. And there, in the teeth of one machine's bucket, something thin and leather-bound caught the operator's eye. It was a journal. Its cover warped with mildew, its pages brittle but intact. Inside, the ink had bled into brown stains, but the handwriting was legible, delicate looping script that belonged not to a child, but to the mother. The entries were obsessive. They began a week after the picnic and stretched across nearly a decade. She described the reeds in detail, how they swayed even on windless nights, how they seemed to bend toward the water as if bowing. She catalogued the sounds, the tapping, the whispering, the rhythmic hum that sometimes rose from the lake at dawn. She wrote of dreams where her daughters stood at the water's edge, hands clasped, smiling, but their eyes were hollow as if filled with silt. And she wrote of bargains. One passage chilled investigators most. They are not gone. They are below. The lake does not drown, it holds. It wants an answer, an offering. If I listen long enough, I will know what it asks. The journal was sealed, tagged as evidence stored in a county archive. But word spread fast. The townspeople began to whisper that she had not been mad with grief as they once believed, but had been speaking plainly, warning them. And if that were true, then her disappearance was not surrender, but completion. She had given herself to whatever waited in the reeds. After the discovery, the lake seemed to grow louder. One fisherman claimed he heard singing beneath his boat, two voices weaving through each other in a low, rising harmony. A hunter swore he saw lantern light bobbing through the trees on a night when no one should have been out. Even deputies began to falter. One officer admitted on record that while searching the north bank, he found a jar buried shallow in the mud. Inside it, a slip of paper with the words, "Not yet. Keep waiting." He returned it to the water. He said he didn't want to know if the handwriting matched hers. By the time the 30-year mark approached, the line between folklore and fact had dissolved entirely. Faulkner was no longer just the town where two sisters vanished during a picnic. It had become a place where the missing did not vanish at all, but lingered, pressed against the surface, demanding to be remembered. Then in the summer of 2022, a final trace emerged. Two boys wandered too close to the northern bank during a dare. The sun was falling, the air heavy with the metallic tang of rain, when they heard it 3 sharp knocks, steady as a fist against wood, echoing from the lake's surface. The boys froze. One of them swore later that he saw a hand, pale, dripping, reaching from the reeds, before it slid soundlessly back beneath the water. Terrified, they fled, but in their panic, one tripped near the willow. His palm landed against its roots, and there he felt it, a hollow space hidden deep within. Curiosity overcame fear. He scraped away soil, pried at the bark, and pulled something free. It was another letter. This one was written on newer paper, not warped or yellowed. The ink was fresh, and the handwriting, though eerily similar to the mother's, was steady, deliberate, too clean to have survived underground for decades. It said only, 30 years is long enough. Come see. The letter was turned over to authorities, but no one could explain how it had arrived there. Some swore the mother had left it years after her supposed disappearance. Others believed it was a message from the sisters themselves. And a few those who had lived long enough to hear every story, every whisper, every knock, believed something else entirely. That the lake had learned to write. Today, Faulkner remains haunted. The northern bank is fenced off, the willow chained, the reeds left untouched. But at night, people still gather in secret, standing quiet with lanterns in hand. They wait for the ripples, for the knocking, for the faint voices threading through the air. And when they return home, their clothes damp with the smell of mildew and silt, they cannot sleep. For in the silence of their rooms, they swear they hear it again. The sound that began everything. 3 soft knocks. Patient. Certain. Waiting.